Hello, welcome again to another episode on Talk Architecture with your hosts, Naziaty Mohd Yaacob. And we're continuing on the second part of this article and commentaries on this article under the umbrella term of architecture and disability. And this one is focusing on designing for disability justice, on the need to take a variety of human bodies into account. An article by Matthew Allen on GSD Harvard Edu website that was written on February 10, 2021. We were discussing about deaf space, and we'll continue with the next paragraph on it. We were also talking about standardization, and the problem is using standardization to design for space for disability. However, we want to go into it further. We want to look into what has been said and the critical model of disability. We want to go into that as well, rather than the usual models that we know, which is medical and social model. So this we continue from where we left off in part 1, and we go to part 2 with this, continuing with the next paragraph, which is mentioning of deaf space as one example of how a form of sensory knowledge has been systematized into concepts that are useful for designers, that is paying attention to lighting and color to reduce eye fatigue. Think a moment there, this is my commentary, think a moment about what a deaf person be using more, which is their vision, in order to understand something in the world, and other senses, taste, smell, touch. But obviously the vision is one which is more commonly used when you can't hear. So obviously the lighting needs to be very well done and enable the deaf person to clearly see, and also the color and how the ambience is in environment need to reduce eye fatigue. We would not want deaf persons to have problems with their visions, so that will even be more challenging for them. So in this paragraph, Mansfield explains that deaf space, quote, deaf space emerges from a set of deaf-centric spatial considerations that are uniquely inherent to how deaf people navigate and claim space, quote. Hendren develops this concept in a book, quote, problem solving is a pattern of attention that gets pretty rote and rigid in design education, especially when it comes to matters like disability. Deaf space is not a program for inclusion, quote, in the flattened sense of, quote, making room for deafness, right? Instead, deaf space is built on a very close observation of behaviors that are already happening among deaf folks, linguistic and social behaviors, spatial relationships, visual fields, and the way sound functions somatically, not just orally, she says, unquote, she says, quote, all of these are evidence of the magnificently adaptive human being doing its thing minute by minute. It's a wonder just as it is. So architecture might proceed more like deaf space does, paying attention to and drawing up an envelope that formalizes the assets of a given population and its users of space, and then, yes, adding the challenges and problems to that mix when they're identified by that population itself. It's a many-dimensional idea of human agency, which inclusion doesn't always encompass. This is a very important paragraph for us to consider as designers. on how the last statement that she said is really important. Paying attention, it says here that architecture proceed more like dev space does, paying attention to and drawing up an envelope that formalizes the assets of a given population and its users of space. And yes, adding the challenges and problems that mix when they identified by the population itself. There is some input given by that population to make it much more than just what is required in the standards. The standards is not a design manual in a way that it is for designers just to follow and replicate, copy, paste. It is like something that, like it says here, formalizing the assets of a given population. But yet you need more input than just the standards. You need to get an understanding. The designer needs to understand more than what is in the standards and go beyond. Again, we see this being implied here. The next paragraph, one reason that disability has not been more thoroughly integrated into design education, is that it is not usually formulated as an exciting challenge. Yeah, that's true. I mean, people would be bored just designing for disabled people, focusing on the standards, or that the perception is that it's medical or social model in which it is like a given, or it's not something that you could dream more. Like you have to have this dream, this is what you need to do, and do it. Like designers would like to have an exciting challenge. So in this paragraph, it first says that the need to adhere to standards and checkboxes can instill a sense of somber rectitude that stifles creative thinking about how to provide meaningful access. Hendren gives an example, quote, "A bathroom with a threshold of the right width measurement for a wheelchair user to get through, but not to turn around once inside, or no handles for transferring." Unquote. But mistakes and misapplications are not the most significant problem. Hendren says, quote, "I think the biggest barrier, of course, is the limited imagination that standards tend to create. Because it's a checklist and a liability matter. The rhetorical framing of disability gets subsumed under that logic, a cloud over the assignment of a project. Or don't forget matter of inclusion. Don't forget this, don't forget that." So again, we have mentioned this quote before. And there is something wrong with it, because as a designer, we need to brainstorm and not put a limit to our imagination. We could think out of the box. We could suggest ideas and innovate things and see how that would work. The most common things like tactile surfaces to guide people from one space to another. I myself had to give consultations on this matter where the designer was thinking, where do we put them? I mean, do we put them everywhere? And I said, no, you don't have to put them in the interior. We refer to blind persons, for example, and they don't really want to comment it too much either. They would want to see that something is giving them a security, a sense of safety when they negotiate external spaces, especially, which is unpredictable, and it could end up falling down into a drain or something. But apart from that, they're not really insisting. So when we design for a disabled person, we need to actually see the comments, the consistent comments that is given to us, and we can decide. We can't just say, "Oh, what do you think? What's next?" Everything comes from the disabled person. We, as a designer, we have a say in it. So that's why I think working as a specialist on accessibility and universal design, I get resentment from the designer on standards, designing according to standards, as if I'm like a headmaster or someone or supervisor of their design. So that is something we could be much more engaging with others and see how that goes. So the next paragraph is, standards should not be dismissed, however. Hendren emphasizes that standards, quote, standards are useful as a benchmark and for creating legally actionable codes for compliance, bracket, that is when they are in fact actionable and not just recommendations, bracket. I think the international symbol of access is a terrific example of standardization. It's an isotype, that creates an instantly recognizable sign that accessible architecture like ramps or automatic doors are close by. It can also function as a symbol that does something pretty profound, protecting parking spaces or seating for folks who need proximity to a building or a bathroom or a fire exit. Knowing what you can expect and knowing it'll be the same internationally, recognizable at a distance and without relying on text of any kind, that's what you want in a solid standard. Well, that's one example of a very good design. Even unquote. So even so, ubiquitous standards are not set in stone. Hendren co-founded the Accessible Icon Project with Brian Glaney, a philosopher and graffiti artist, to update the accessibility icon in a way that, to me, hints at the thrill of racing around in a wheelchair. Next paragraph. The alternative to rote standardization is design.
Looking for creative inspiration? Graphite Pro Radio explores the intersection of design, culture, and innovation, one conversation at a time. Join us for deep dives into the creative process and game-changing ideas. Start listening today.
Or as Hamray puts it, quote, the initiation of critical processes toward iterative world building, unquote. This is something architects are trained to do, questioning the assumptions that frame a project. Quote, from my perspective, accessibility is an open-ended project because what we know or claim to know about who uses accessible design is always changing. 60 years ago, it was barely thinkable to design with wheelchair users in mind, let alone people with chemical sensitivities or mental disabilities. The shifting landscape of legibility for disabled people always yields new approaches to design, unquote. Hamray says, quote, I would say that my work intervenes in these processes of knowing and making. This is a strategy that builds on my training in the tradition of feminist new materialism. which is concerned with the relationship between knowing, making, and ethical acting, and also the field of discourse around critical design. These help me understand that standards can be material and critical, and they do not always have to be reductive. Quote, unquote, sorry. There's interesting thought here about how we could change things. How we as designers, and especially if you're a disabled designer, could be more critical in how we approach. So obviously this is like underlining further the importance of design and critical processes in building this understanding of design and how design could be much more than standards, and that they're not simplistic in a way that veering on bottom, and it is something that we could push further and further. The next quote paragraph is Bainbridge Studio at the GSD also takes aim at reductivism. So the thing to do with reductive and reductivism is being criticized. She notes, quote, we have been taught in the last 30 or 40 years to rely heavily on ecology and science-based research, which sometimes misses the point. It is important to understand that landscape architects design for unique cultural communities. Different communities have different relationships to the vegetal world. How do we uncover what those are? Unquote. She also asked, quote, how do we understand and create a sensory interface that is specific to the community we're working with, rather than defaulting to something that's either aesthetic or ecological? Designers should be accounting for all of our sensory experiences, and yet we usually design quite visually. By designing for people with different abilities, we can understand how to design for all abilities, which creates a more abundant experience for everyone, end quote. Someone who has all the faculties, all the sensories, the five senses, including vision and hearing, would not rely everything on vision, because when we think about sensorial experiences, through looking at design to make us be using the different faculties even more, this will enrich the experience of experiencing a space. The smell, the taste, hearing things, and touching, and also the vision. And we haven't done much of that. And I've talked about sensory design before, and how sensory design is important, even more so than universal design. I mean, take to another level. We know about universal design. We can take this to a level where we are looking at our five senses and more. Wayfinding, in fact, is beyond five senses. And we can feel that we're moving through space because there's a sense of the enclosure as well, or the sense that outside and inside, or far away, of in between, for example. The in-between spaces, which is a very interesting idea of how we put pauses in our sense of the journey that we had earlier. There's a lot of things here, really, that we could learn from this article. And now we're going to the next paragraph. What this means, first of all, is that Bainbridge's students conduct a lot of research When I ask about the many pre-design phases in the course description, Bainbridge smiles and says, quote, student asks, is this how we actually design? Do we come to a project and have conversation with our partners without having a set idea about what the project actually is? Quote, seeking abundance, quote, is reflective of how MASS works. As a nonprofit organization, we start way upstream from where a typical architect would start. We seek our partners and amplify their mission. Often this means we're working with partners who have not had access to design services and don't have a budget yet. If we come to projects early, we can help understand what the mission of the project is and how something built would support their work, unquote. I think also I have similar experience where because of the nature of activism, and I practice activism for many years, and when I approach as a consultant to meet with a client, we give a pro bono consultancy at the beginning, and we determine how much work needed to be done. Then we could envisage what the outcomes should be, and therefore it could be not necessarily design drawings, but it could be design reviews, or it could be an access audit, or consultations that is not repetitive but scheduled in a time frame. And in this case, what was mentioned here from Bainbridge regarding what the students are doing, they are questioning whether this is the design process, a common design process. I had the luxury or the experience of dealing with design thesis before, and how each project has its own challenges. It could be a very much urban project. It could be very much inward, or it could be a very much specialized project, depending whether it's library or market or hospital, whatever. But what it is that there is certainly clients, and some people could represent all the users, like someone we asked for their help to advise on the hospital systems, and they would provide that angle from where the problems that patients have, for example, in hospital design or library, so talking to a client could be biased. The client could be biased, or if you talk to a client user, specific users, it could be that the building is not for this, like the deaf community, or 100% for the deaf people, but it could be just a community building, and you consider all types of users. And then the students would learn a lot from this process of investigation, or this process of consulting with the users before they start and come up with the project brief, and that would conjure a lot of design problems they need to attend to when they design. So we're still talking about studios, and not the last paragraph, but the next paragraph is, because studios have been taught remotely to students located around the world, Bainbridge encouraged her students to seek out partners near where they were located. Okay, so the students are not necessarily from where Bainbridge is teaching. They came up with an eclectic list. Perkins School for the Blind, a very well-attended deaf gathering space in Wuhan, China. More marginalized communities like the Abenaki in New Hampshire and many others. Students talk with members of these communities to uncover aspects of their spatial sensory awareness. This engagement helps create a common language around sense between the students and the clients. Adding depth to this investigation, students were asked to set up specific situations for their classmates to experience. Each student is creating an experience with one aspect of sensory intake that they are inviting others to, having them experience the world through that sense in that particular way has created an expanded vocabulary for design in the studio. Now the question is, how can it create a more abundant palette for creating landscapes? This word, spatial sensory awareness, that the students need to uncover, means at first they need to recognize and they need to have some reading and understanding of the topic, in which it also deals with disabilities. And here we're not talking only about typical disabilities, but different communities, which is very interesting indeed. So I think I would go into the next paragraph just as a way of concluding this part 2 of a 3-part series on designing for disability justice. It is worth reflecting further on why the usual methods of design do not address the variety of human bodies. As a historian, Hamre notes that during the period in which the design disciplines have been professionalized, there have not been many efforts to enable disabled people to become designers, or until recently to recognize disabled people as designers and inventors, even when they have not had professional training. This is likely because of long histories of centering idealized bodies in the disciplines such as architecture, and of more recent histories of measuring and standardizing bodies in fields such as industrial design. Unquote. Mansfield echoes Hamre's observation, commenting that, quote, there have, of course, been many attempts to change this, starting in the 1970s with interventions in design curricula and professional licensing, but ableism is entrenched and takes more than a class or a continuing education credit to uproot, unquote. This prospect of having disabled persons also be considered as designers is how we would need to change our mindset and include disabled persons in the design. I have tried this method where we did mock-ups of a bus stop, and disabled person would come and give their opinion about the mock-ups. And that means the disabled person is also a designer, in which they are aware, spatial, what did we say earlier? Spatial sensory awareness by the disabled person themselves, which they have all the time, in which they recommend to the designer how the space should be. But this is even much more than that. What Hamre is saying, that they could be a designer as well. What is a designer? We understand a designer is one that imagines, and one that dream, and one that see the possibilities of what the design could do. And so if we're looking at it based on these points, then the disabled person could be a designer in that sense. Because, one thing that I have practiced, knowing critical dimensions. I call them critical dimensions that I need to have, but I'm not saying that they are limited. What I'm saying is that there is a minimum dimension that we need to adhere to, but we can expand even further, but we need to understand when we expand further, when we have a larger space, we still need certain things to happen. And depending on your disability, it's not easy for me to think of other disabilities, obviously. So there need to be different points of views coming in, like a blind person or a deaf person or other people coming in to give their comments about the design. So with that, I will stop for part 2 and I will continue with part 3 in the conclusion. We have a few more, just a few more paragraphs before we come to the conclusion of this series on designing for disability justice based on an article by GSD Harvard EDU. So thank you for listening to part 2.